Some coincidences feel harmless until history reveals patterns so precise, so eerie, they leave you wondering whether fate is just playing a game we'll never understand. 15. The book that found its way back to Anne Parrish. In the quiet corners of a second-hand bookstore in Paris, a simple moment turned into one of the most quietly chilling coincidences ever recorded. It was 1929, and American author Anne Parrish was vacationing with her husband, browsing old books along the Seine. As she moved through the dusty shelves, a well-worn children's book caught her eye, Jack Frost and Other Stories. She paused. It was one of her childhood favorites, a story she hadn't seen since she was a little girl growing up in Colorado Springs. Smiling with nostalgia, she picked it up and showed it to her husband, telling him about how much the book had meant to her. Out of curiosity, he opened it to the inside cover and stopped. There, written neatly on the flyleaf, were the words, Anne Parrish, 209 North Weber Street, Colorado Springs. It was her book, the exact same copy she had owned as a child, not a reprint, not just a similar edition. Her actual book, her name, her childhood address, somehow sitting on a shelf thousands of miles away from where she had last seen it. How it ended up in Paris remains unknown. Had it been donated, sold, or misplaced decades earlier? Had it passed through the hands of travelers, collectors, or strangers who never realized its origin? The journey it took to return to Anne was never traced. The moment itself is gentle and strange, not frightening, but undeniably eerie, the kind of coincidence that feels too deliberate to be random. Some call it fate, others call it a statistical anomaly. But for those who hear the story, it often leaves a chill. Anne Parrish was no stranger to books. She was a successful writer herself. But even in her career, few stories could match the quiet, uncanny feeling of that real-life chapter she stumbled into that day in Paris. Because sometimes the things we think are lost forever find their way back when we least expect them. 14. Flight 666 to Hell, an unsettling journey in the sky. T sounds like something from a horror movie. Flight 666 to Hell, departing on Friday the 13th. But for years, it was a very real and very routine flight operated by Finnair, the national airline of Finland. Flight number 666 regularly traveled from Copenhagen, Denmark, CPH, to Helsinki, Finland, and Helsinki's airport code, you guessed it, HEL. So yes, Flight 666 to Hell was, quite literally, a flight to hell. This bizarre coincidence first gained attention in aviation circles before quickly going viral online. Travelers and superstition lovers alike were fascinated. The date made it even eerier. On multiple occasions, Flight 666 to Hell took off on Friday the 13th, a date widely associated with bad luck and ominous events. Despite the eerie branding, the flights were entirely safe and often uneventful. Pilots and passengers took the attention in stride, with many joking about it on social media. Some even said it was the luckiest flight in the sky because it never had serious issues despite its spooky call sign. But not everyone found it charming. Some travelers refused to book tickets on it, unnerved by the combination of numbers and symbolism. Finnair, while initially amused by the buzz, eventually made a quiet change. In 2017, Flight 666 to HEL took off for the very last time under that number. The airline rebranded it to Flight 954, citing standard scheduling changes. But many believe the eerie association played a part in its retirement. Still, the story lives on as one of aviation's strangest coincidences, a perfect storm of numbering, location codes, and cultural superstition that gave an otherwise ordinary flight an unforgettable reputation. And while Flight 666 to Hell is no longer in service, it remains a favorite tale for travelers who believe that sometimes truth really is stranger than fiction. Because in the sky, where logic rules and safety is paramount, every now and then something oddly poetic manages to sneak through the clouds. 13. The Accidental Reunion, a double exposure that revealed a hidden connection. Sometimes a photograph captures more than just a moment. It captures a mystery. In 1914, a young German man named Herr Scherl was taking photos in Strasbourg, then part of the German Empire. One of the photos was of his daughter standing in a public square. Like many amateur photographers at the time, he used glass plates to capture his images. After taking the shot, he carefully stored the plate and, for whatever reason, never developed it. Years later, as World War I swept through Europe, the family relocated, and the glass plate was misplaced, left behind with countless other forgotten belongings. Eventually, it ended up at a second-hand shop, where it was purchased by another amateur photographer who had no idea of its history. Not realizing the plate had already been used, the new owner loaded it into his camera and took a photograph of his own daughter, standing in nearly the same square. When the film was developed, the result was eerie. On the same image were two girls, layered on top of each other, as if they had been standing in the same place, but at different times. One was faded, the other clearer, but both unmistakably present. The double exposure created a haunting overlap. Two separate lives, unknowingly joined by a reused glass plate. Decades later, the story made its way into photography journals and folklore circles. And here's where it gets even stranger. Years after the photo was taken, the two families met. The girls in the image, now grown, crossed paths and discovered they had appeared together in a photo long before they'd ever spoken a word to one another. The chances of it happening are incredibly slim. Two strangers, two families, one camera plate, reused at random, and yet, somehow, a simple act of photography became a bridge between two lives. Was it chance? A twist of fate? Or something more meaningful? An invisible thread connecting people before they ever knew it? Whatever the explanation, the image remains one of the most quietly haunting coincidences ever captured, because sometimes the past leaves its shadow in the perfect place, just waiting to be seen. 12. The ghost seat at the poker table, the strange case of Robert Fallon. It was just another poker game in San Francisco in the 1850s, until one player's luck turned deadly. A man named Robert Fallon had been on a winning streak that raised more than just eyebrows. The other players, convinced he was cheating, grew angry. Tensions escalated, and according to the legend, someone in the group shot Fallon on the spot. He collapsed at the table, dead, with $600 in poker winnings piled in front of him. Shaken but not ready to end the game, the remaining players decided to continue, but they needed someone to fill Fallon's seat and keep the table going. So they found a passerby, a young man who agreed to join in and take over Fallon's chips to keep the betting fair. The game went on, and the newcomer held his own. That is, until the police arrived to investigate Fallon's death. That's when things got strange. As the story goes, the officers asked for everyone's identification and background. When the young man introduced himself and gave his story, jaws dropped. He was Robert Fallon's son. The two hadn't seen each other in years. Neither had known the other was in town. And now, in one of the strangest turns imaginable, a man had unknowingly stepped into the seat and onto the winnings of his own father, moments after his mysterious death. Coincidence? A twist of fate? Or something that simply couldn't be explained? The legend has survived for generations, retold around poker tables and late-night campfires alike. Historians have debated the details, and skeptics have questioned the timeline. But whether it's fact, folklore, or something in between, the story taps into a fear and fascination that runs deeper than cards and chips. That we can cross paths with destiny in ways we never expect, and sometimes it pulls up a chair beside us before we even realize it, because in this case, the hand dealt wasn't just about luck, it was legacy. 11. Twice saved by the same man, the falling baby, and Joseph Figlock. In the heart of 1930s, Detroit, a quiet street sweeper named Joseph Figlock became the center of a coincidence so surreal it still leaves people shaking their heads nearly a century later. Figlock worked for the city, cleaning alleys and sidewalks, an unassuming job with little fanfare. But in 1937, as he went about his regular route, something unbelievable happened. A baby, left momentarily unattended in an apartment several stories up, fell from a window directly above him. As fate would have it, Figlock passed beneath at that exact moment. The child landed squarely on him, breaking the fall and sparing both the baby and Figlock from what could have been a tragic end. It was an astonishing save, 1 in a million, some said. But then came the twist. 1 year later, in 1938, Figlock was sweeping a different alley in a completely unrelated part of the city when another baby, also left near an open window, fell from above, and once again, it landed directly on Joseph Figlock. Both infants survived. Figlock, remarkably, did too. 2 random children, 2 separate neighborhoods, 2 different accidents, 1 man. Local newspapers were stunned. Figlock became something of a folk hero, celebrated for his quiet bravery and the surreal circumstances that placed him in the right spot not once, but twice. It wasn't just the odds that captured imaginations. It was the calm way he handled both events, reportedly more concerned about the babies than himself. Statisticians tried to explain it. Perhaps urban living in multi-story buildings made such falls slightly more likely. Maybe Figlock's daily routes took him near high-risk areas. But even with those factors, the chance of catching 2 falling babies in 2 years, unrelated, unplanned, is astronomically rare. For some, it was fate. For others, pure chance. Either way, Joseph Figlock never sought recognition. He simply returned to his broom and resumed his shift, quietly carrying the weight of lives he unknowingly saved. In a world where headlines often focus on chaos, this strange double event serves as a reminder. Sometimes the universe catches you when you fall, and it just might look like a man with a broom walking by at the perfect moment. 10. The King's Double. When Italy's monarch met his mirror. In 1900, King Umberto I of Italy stepped into a small restaurant in the city of Monza, expecting a quiet meal. What he found instead was a living reflection of himself, and one of history's strangest recorded coincidences. The restaurant owner who greeted him looked uncannily identical to the king, but that was just the beginning. As they spoke, the details of their lives began to mirror each other in ways that stunned everyone in the room. Both men were named Umberto. Both were born on the exact same day, March 14th, 1844. Both were born in the same town, just miles apart. Both had married women named Margarita. And, most bizarre of all, they had both been honored for acts of bravery in the military. A monarch and a commoner, separated by class, but seemingly duplicated in life. The king, amused and intrigued, reportedly arranged to return to the restaurant the next day to continue their conversation. But that meeting would never happen. On July 29th, 1900, the day after their strange encounter, the restaurant owner was shot and killed in a mysterious incident. Only hours later, King Umberto himself was assassinated by an anarchist at a public event, just as he had been warned might happen. 2 men, 2 lives, 2 deaths, on the same day. The eerie parallel between their lives and their ends sparked rumors that still persist today. Some saw it as a sign, others called it a warning. A few even believed that one was the other in disguise, though no credible evidence supports that theory. What remains is a haunting coincidence that defies easy explanation. History is filled with odd parallels, but this one stands apart. Not just for its strange details, but for how closely 2 very different men's lives were aligned down to the hour of their deaths. Was it destiny, a statistical anomaly, or something else? In the end, King Umberto's encounter with his doppelganger is remembered not just for how strange it was, but for how quickly and tragically it was followed by silence. Because sometimes, when history looks in the mirror, it blinks. 9. The strange fate of Joseph Aigner, saved by a silent stranger. Joseph Aigner was a gifted Austrian portrait painter in the 19th century. Talented, respected, and well-connected, He seemed to live a life most artists would envy, but behind his success was a deep and persistent struggle with depression, one that led him to the edge not once, but multiple times. His life might have ended early, if not for the quiet presence of a man he never truly knew. At the age of 18, Aigner attempted to take his own life, but was interrupted by the sudden appearance of a Capuchin monk who stopped him without a word. Years later, at age 22, he tried again, and the same monk appeared, this time even more unexpectedly, once again preventing the act. It happened a third time when Aigner was 32. Still tormented, he planned to end his life in a secluded part of Vienna, but was found and saved by the same monk, who, yet again, refused to explain how or why he had arrived in time. No connection between the two men could be found. The monk never gave a name. He simply showed up when he was needed, then disappeared. Eventually, Aigner found more stability in life and in his career, becoming a respected professor and painter. But the mystery of the silent monk stayed with him. Years later, in 1889, Joseph Aigner passed away of natural causes at the age of 68, and at his funeral, among the mourners was a familiar figure in the crowd, the very same Capuchin monk, now older. Silent as ever, he had saved Aigner's life 3 times, and now he watched over him one final time. No one ever discovered the monk's identity. Aigner never claimed to know who he was. And yet his presence was a thread woven through the painter's most vulnerable moments, appearing when all hope seemed lost, and vanishing before questions could be asked. Was it coincidence? A guardian? Something stranger? No one knows. What remains is a quiet, chilling story of 2 men, one seeking an end, the other offering a beginning, and the unspoken connection that bound them together across time, without explanation. 8. The Bermuda taxi mystery, struck by the same cab, a year apart. Some stories are hard to believe even when they're true, and in the case of 2 brothers in Bermuda, tragedy didn't just strike twice, it followed the exact same pattern, down to the most unsettling detail. In the early 1970s, a young man was riding his moped along a quiet road in Hamilton, Bermuda. It was an ordinary day, and the road was one he knew well. But fate had other plans. As he crossed the street, a taxi came around the corner and struck him. The crash was fatal. The incident was tragic, but not particularly unusual for that time and place. Accidents happened, and though heartbreaking, life moved forward. But then, something unthinkable happened. Exactly 1 year later, almost to the day, the young man's brother was riding the same moped along the same stretch of road when he too was hit and killed by a taxi. It was horrifying enough that both brothers had died in the same way. But as the details of the second accident unfolded, the coincidences stacked higher and higher. The taxi that hit the second brother, it was the exact same vehicle that had struck his older brother a year before. And the driver behind the wheel, the same person who had been driving the cab in the first accident. And, perhaps most chilling of all, the passenger in the back seat of the taxi during both accidents, also the same person. 3 people, 1 moped, 2 tragedies, and 1 year separating 2 events that felt more like a loop in time than a coincidence. This extraordinary case stunned investigators and residents alike. While it was ruled a tragic accident, with no foul play involved, people couldn't help but question the odds. How could so many exact details line up, completely independent of each other, across 2 separate lives? Some chalked it up to Bermuda being a small island. Fewer vehicles, tighter communities, shared routes. But even those factors can't explain the precise, eerie repetition that played out. Others saw it as fate, a strange echo of grief and destiny repeating itself in a way no one could stop, a cruel twist that left a family shattered twice, by the same set of wheels, guided by the same hands. No one was charged. There was no wrongdoing, just timing, and something no one could name. To this day, the Bermuda taxi mystery remains one of the most unnerving real-life coincidences on record. Because sometimes, the world doesn't just mirror itself, It reenacts its most painful moments with haunting precision. And in this case, tragedy didn't just knock twice, it came driving the same cab. 7. The twin tragedy, a mirror, image death on the same road. In 2002, a quiet rural highway in northern Finland became the stage for a tragic coincidence so precise, so eerie, it left even seasoned investigators stunned. It began with a man in his 70s, riding his bicycle across the highway near the town of Raahe. He had made this ride many times before, but on this day, he was struck and killed by a passing truck. A tragic accident, but not an uncommon one on such open roads. Just 2 hours later, and barely a mile down the same highway, another cyclist attempted the same crossing and was struck and killed by another truck. But when police arrived to identify the second victim, what they discovered turned the tragedy into something nearly unthinkable. The two men weren't just strangers passing through. They were identical twin brothers. Each had decided independently to ride along the same stretch of road that day. Neither knew the other had gone out, and despite living just a short distance apart, their families said the two had not made plans to meet. Both were 70 years old, born within minutes of each other, and now gone, within hours, under almost identical circumstances. Finnish authorities, experienced and methodical, were left without any explanation beyond the facts. There was no foul play, no miscommunication, just two separate tragic moments linked not by design, but by blood and fate. One police officer was quoted as saying, "It made the hair on my neck stand up. It sounds like a made-up story." And yet, it wasn't. For many, the story of the twin tragedy serves as a reminder of the strange, mirrored rhythms that sometimes surface in life, especially among siblings and, most mysteriously, twins. Scientists have long studied the bond between twins, how they sometimes make decisions in sync or sense each other's pain, even from a distance. This case offers no clear proof of that connection, but it raises questions that linger. Were these moments truly separate? Or was something deeper at play, some unseen thread that pulled them, one last time, down the same road? Whatever the answer, the story stands as one of the most haunting coincidences in modern history. A pair of lives that began together and ended almost exactly the same way. 6. The human lightning rod. Struck 7 times and still standing. For most people, a lightning strike is a once-in-a-lifetime event, if it ever happens at all. But for one man, it wasn't once, or twice, or even 3 times. It was 7. Meet Roy Sullivan, a park ranger in Virginia's Shenandoah National Park, who holds the world record for the most documented lightning strikes survived by a single person. His story is so unbelievable, so mathematically improbable, that it feels more like folklore than fact. But it's all true. Sullivan's first encounter happened in 1942. He was in a newly built fire lookout tower, one of the tallest points in the area, when a storm rolled in. The tower had no lightning rod, and Sullivan took a direct hit. That was strike number 1. Over the next few decades, lightning seemed to develop a strange fixation on him. Strike 2 came while driving his truck through the mountains. A bolt struck nearby trees, bounced through the open window, and hit him. Strike 3, while tending his garden. Strike 4, while working inside his ranger station. And the list goes on. 7 different times, in different places, under different circumstances. Each time, Sullivan survived, though not without injury. He lost toenails, burned his hair more than once, and suffered various burns and bruises. After his 6th strike, he reportedly started carrying a can of water with him at all times, just in case. What makes his story even stranger is that in several of these incidents, he was the only one struck, despite being surrounded by people. No one else was ever harmed. It earned him the nickname, the human lightning rod. He was recognized by the Guinness World Records, featured in newspapers around the world, and even inspired scientific curiosity. Yet Sullivan never sought fame. He remained humble, even quietly bewildered by his fate. Statisticians have tried to calculate the odds, Being struck once is roughly a 1 in 15,000 chance over a lifetime. 7 times. It's practically incalculable. Sullivan's life became a strange dance with nature, one that followed him for decades through weather and wilderness. And through it all, he kept working, kept serving, kept walking trails beneath the very sky that wouldn't leave him alone. He passed away in 1983, not from lightning, but from unrelated causes. Even in death, he remains a mystery, proof that sometimes nature doesn't just play by the odds. It picks someone, and for reasons we'll never understand, keeps choosing them. Because in Roy Sullivan's case, lightning didn't just strike twice. It struck again, and he walked away every single time. 5. Founding Fathers in Sync, the final coincidence of Jefferson and Adams. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were more than just political giants. They were thinkers, writers, and revolutionaries who helped shape the very foundation of the United States. As key architects of the Declaration of Independence, they stood together at one of the most pivotal moments in American history. But their relationship was complex. In the years following independence, they became bitter political rivals. Adams a Federalist, Jefferson a Democratic Republican. They exchanged heated letters, clashed on the direction of the new republic, and eventually drifted apart. Yet with time, their hostility faded. In 1812, after years of silence, Adams wrote a letter to Jefferson. Jefferson replied, and thus began one of the most remarkable correspondences in American history, a friendship rekindled through paper and ink, filled with reflections on government, philosophy, and the uncertain future of the nation they helped create. Their final years were spent not in power, but in thought. Jefferson at Monticello in Virginia, Adams at Peacefield in Massachusetts. They remained far apart physically, but connected in spirit, aging statesmen watching their revolutionary dream evolve from a distance. Then came a moment of symmetry no one could have predicted. On July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years to the day after the adoption of the Declaration of Independence, both men passed away. Jefferson died first, early in the morning, at age 83. He had been ill for weeks, but family noted that he had seemed to hold on, waiting for that symbolic day to arrive. Just a few hours later, Adams passed in his own home, at age 90. His final words were quiet and strangely poignant. Thomas Jefferson survives. He didn't know that his friend had already died. Two men, whose lives had been shaped by revolution, rivalry, and reconciliation, died within hours of each other on the golden anniversary of the country they helped birth. Historians were stunned. The timing was almost too perfect to be real. 5 years later, another founding father, James Monroe, would also die on July 4th, making the coincidence even more haunting. But it's Jefferson and Adams whose final chapter feels written by history itself. Their lives trace the arc of the nation, from bold beginnings to uncertain legacy, and when it was time to leave, they did so together. Some called it fate, others saw it as poetic justice. But for a country just finding its footing, the moment was unforgettable. Because sometimes history doesn't just honor its heroes, it gives them a curtain call, time to the very day their words first changed the world. 4. Mark Twain and Halley's Comet. A life bookended by the stars. Some lives feel larger than history itself. And then there's the life of Mark Twain, author, humorist, and observer of the human condition, whose story began and ended beneath the same streak of light in the sky. Samuel Langhorne Clemens, better known as Mark Twain, was born in 1835 in the small town of Florida, Missouri. That same year, a brilliant visitor passed overhead, Halley's Comet, making its routine 76-year journey past Earth. At the time, no one could have guessed that this newborn would grow up to be one of America's most iconic voices, or that the comet lighting up the sky above him would return for an unforgettable encore at the end of his life. Twain's wit was sharp, his writing timeless, and his observations often laced with cosmic irony. And in a moment of uncanny foresight, He once said, "I came in with Halley's Comet in 1835. It is coming again next year, and I expect to go out with it." It wasn't just a passing remark. Twain saw a kind of personal alignment between himself and the comet, a cosmic bookend to a life filled with satire, adventure, and insight. And incredibly, he was right. Halley's Comet made its return in April 1910. Just one day after it reached its closest point to Earth, Mark Twain passed away in his Connecticut home at the age of 74. His death, so precisely tied to the comet's return, felt more like a literary twist than a real-life event. Newspapers, fans, and historians alike were stunned by the timing. It was as if Twain had written his own final chapter, and the universe quietly honored the script. Of course, science reminds us that Halley's Comet doesn't respond to people or poetry. Its orbit is predictable, and its return was expected. But Twain's life, beginning and ending with the comet, feels more meaningful than math. To this day, the coincidence remains one of history's most haunting alignments. A man who made a career out of storytelling, leaving the stage just as the same celestial marker reappeared above. Because sometimes life really does follow a rhythm written in the stars, and in Twain's case it was a curtain call that no one could have staged more perfectly. 3. The separated twins who lived the same life, Jim Lewis and Jim Springer. N. 1940. Twin boys were born in Ohio and placed for adoption. Their biological mother wasn't able to care for them, so each child was given to a different family, complete strangers, with no knowledge of the other's existence. The families didn't know each other, the boys never met, but both couples, by pure chance, named their son Jim. So began one of the most fascinating stories of synchronicity ever recorded. For 39 years, Jim Lewis and Jim Springer lived entirely separate lives. They grew up in different towns, had different friends, and lived completely unaware that they had a twin. But despite the distance, their lives began to unfold in eerily identical ways. Both boys loved math and woodworking, but struggled with spelling. Both owned a dog named Toy. Each had married a woman named Linda, divorced her, and then remarried, this time to a woman named Betty. Both had a son, one named James Allen, the other James Allen, with nearly identical spellings. And incredibly, both drove the same model car, smoked the same brand of cigarettes, and vacationed at the same beach in Florida. The list goes on. The coincidences piled so high that when they finally met in 1979, it wasn't just a family reunion. It was a phenomenon. Researchers at the University of Minnesota, who were conducting studies on twins separated at birth, quickly became involved. The Jim twins, as they were dubbed, became part of a major psychological study that explored nature versus nurture. The results startled even the scientists. Although raised in different environments, the two men shared similar voice patterns, laughs, habits, and even heart rates. Their brainwave tests were nearly indistinguishable. How could two people, separated from infancy, live such parallel lives? Some pointed to genetics, others saw something deeper, that there might be invisible threads of experience that pull us in similar directions, even without us knowing. Jim Lewis and Jim Springer weren't just a curiosity. They became proof that sometimes life follows a script we don't even know we're reading. Their story sparked debates about free will, fate, and how much of who we are is shaped before we ever make a single decision. It's rare for coincidence to feel this exact. Two men, two lives, mirrored across time, distance, and identity. And when they finally looked each other in the eye, it must have felt like more than a reunion. It must have felt like stepping into a life they somehow already knew. 2. Poe's prophetic tale, the real-life shipwreck that mirrored his fiction. In 1838, Edgar Allan Poe published his only complete novel, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. It was a dark and twisting sea tale filled with mutiny, shipwrecks, and desperate survival. But within that fictional chaos was one detail that would echo chillingly into real life, a character named Richard Parker. In Poe's novel, Parker is one of the survivors of a doomed voyage. After their ship sinks, the few men who remain stranded on a lifeboat are pushed to the edge. With no food or water, they draw lots, and Richard Parker is the one sacrificed and eaten to keep the others alive. At the time, the novel was met with mixed reviews. Some found it too bleak or unbelievable, and yet, decades later, the story would become disturbingly prophetic. In 1884, nearly 50 years after Poe's book was published, a yacht called the Mignonette set sail from England to Australia. Partway through the journey, the ship was destroyed in a storm. 4 men escaped on a small lifeboat with few supplies. Days passed, then weeks. With no rescue in sight and no food or water, the crew made a desperate decision. They killed and ate the youngest among them, a cabin boy who had fallen ill. His name, Richard Parker. Just like Poe's fictional character, the details were so eerily similar that many thought it had to be an urban legend, but it wasn't. The case was real, thoroughly documented, and became a landmark legal case in England, raising ethical debates about survival and justice at sea. The coincidence? Unexplainable. There was no indication that the real-life Richard Parker had any connection to Poe's novel. His name was common, but the circumstances weren't. The method, the isolation, the desperation, all aligned perfectly with what Poe had imagined. Was it an incredible example of fiction foreshadowing reality, or something more mysterious? A tale written too close to a future that hadn't happened yet. Even today, literary scholars and historians revisit this case, marveling at the overlap between imagination and history. Because sometimes a story doesn't just predict the future, it calls it by name. 1. The war that began and ended with the same grave. World War I began with a shot and ended with silence. In between, more than 20 million people lost their lives. The war changed the world in ways no one could have imagined. And yet, one of its strangest stories lies not in a battle or treaty, but in a quiet cemetery in Belgium. Near the town of Mons, 2 graves sit just 6 feet apart in Saint-Symphorien Military Cemetery. Their names aren't world famous, but their placement tells a story that history could never have written better. The first grave belongs to Private John Parr, a British reconnaissance cyclist. On August 21, 1914, just weeks after Britain entered the war, Parr encountered German forces near Mons and was killed. He is widely believed to be the first British soldier to die in World War I. The second grave belongs to Private George Edwin Ellison, also of the British Army. He died on November 11, 1918, the very last day of the war, just hours before the armistice took effect, and somehow, in a coincidence so perfect it feels scripted, these 2 men, the first and last British soldiers killed in the war, were laid to rest within steps of each other. Neither burial was planned with this eerie symmetry in mind. Their bodies were found and interred at different times, long before anyone realized the significance of their deaths. It wasn't until years later, when records were reviewed, that the pattern emerged. The odds are staggering. The British Army suffered over 700,000 deaths during the war. Graves are scattered across Europe, from muddy fields to manicured cemeteries. And yet these 2 soldiers, separated by 4 years of unimaginable destruction, now lie face to face, bookends to a war that should have never been. Even the cemetery itself adds to the symbolism. Saint-Symphorien was originally created by the Germans as a respectful burial ground for both Allied and German troops. Today, British and German graves still stand side by side, silent reminders of lives lost, regardless of uniform. Visitors often pause at the graves of Parr and Ellison, not just because of their timing, but because of what their proximity suggests. That even in chaos, history sometimes ties its loose ends with eerie precision. Some see it as a coincidence, others call it fate, but whatever the explanation, it's hard not to feel the weight of it. 1 war, 4 years, millions gone, and 2 men whose stories now meet forever in a patch of grass and stone. Because sometimes history doesn't just repeat or rhyme, sometimes it folds in on itself and ends where it began. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like the video and to subscribe to the channel.